I would next like to, before going to our Iranian contingent or people who can talk to us about Iran, I would like to ask Paul Pillar, please, to come. Paul Pillar has joined Georgetown as a visiting professor and director of studies of the Security Studies program at the School of Foreign Service after many years of distinguished service in the U.S. Intelligence community. The reason I suggested that we invite Paul is that I have been reading his stuff lately quite regularly, and I was, to be honest, incredibly impressed both by his foresight but also by his objectivity and the sort of calm way he approaches various issues. He is author of several books and innumerable articles and so on, but also his experience in areas that now are issues in U.S.-Iran relations makes him an invaluable speaker for us. Paul, could you please?
Thank you, Shireen, for that very generous introduction. I'm pleased to follow Ambassador Jim Dobbins, whose work, along with his RAND colleagues on this particular topic, I think is surpassed by no one's. I would highly recommend if at least reading the version that Jim brought today, if not the longer versions of their work on the topic. The discourse on this problem of Iran here in the United States has, in my judgment, been a very defective discourse as we see it played out in public debate. And one indication of this, I think, is the fact that we've had an Iranian nuclear program going back to the time of the Shah. We've had, in the intervening decades, including the more than 3 decades of the Islamic Republic, succeeding, repeated projections that we were on the verge of seeing an Iranian nuke. And when I say projections, I'm talking about the official estimates as well as the unofficial ones. I was just looking back at some of my stuff that I'd written on this, which included an op-ed in the Washington Post that examined some of the questions that I thought needed to be asked before any thought was given to exercising the military option. That was 5 years ago. People were talking about that. Well, we've obviously had kind of a crescendo over the last year and especially over the last few months of attention to this issue. And I think that's clearly related to the fact that we have a presidential election year. And it's related to everything having to do with the role of Israel in U.S. politics. It's related much more to those things than it is to what's going on the ground, technically speaking, in Iran. I think the single most defective part of the discourse and the debate has been a relative inattention to the issue of exactly what difference an Iranian nuclear weapon, should one be built, would or would not make. That has been treated in a kind of taken for granted conventional wisdom. Of course it would be a very bad thing and we have to avoid it somehow, either militarily or diplomatically kind of way. What passes for analysis has been basically throwing out speculative worst case musings. And there's really no excuse for this because, you know, we had all during the Cold War and the standoff between the US and the Soviets as far as nuclear weapons were concerned, very astute, detailed analysis at places like RAND that gave us a model for looking at what difference an Iranian nuke would or would not make. I've written about this at some length. I'm not going to go over all the details of my own analysis here, but let me summarize it this way. What you do here in the discourse to support the idea that an Iranian nuke would be a very bad thing, I would agree with probably everyone in this room, or at least most people in this room. I think the world would be much better off without an Iranian nuclear weapon for various reasons. But we have to ask ourselves exactly what the difference would likely make, when we compare it with other things we might do, particularly the so-called military option, the things that Jim Dobbins talked about. What passes for analysis takes one of two forms. One, which you hear more from the politicians than from policy analysts, is the idea that the Iranian leadership just doesn't think like we do. They're irrational, they're a bunch of mad mullahs, they're religious fanatics, they don't care about this life, they only care about the afterlife. And the problem with that is it simply doesn't conform with the behavior of the Islamic Republic. which has given every indication of being like many other regimes in which the overwhelming priority for them is to maintain their power and their position in this life, not some afterlife. The more sophisticated sounding kind of analysis, which you hear less from the politicians and more from some policy analysts, is that, well, all right, they're not going to do something crazy like lob a nuke at Tel Aviv the first time they've got one, but just the mere possession of nuclear weapons is going to make a big difference in their behavior in the region in a way that will make them more dangerous, more aggressive, and so on. And all that I can extract from what I hear about that is a vague sense that somehow a nuclear-armed Iran would feel its oats in a way that would make them a little bit more smug in the way they would carry themselves in Middle Eastern affairs. But if you start asking the tough, detailed questions, the kind of things that the analysts asked during the Cold War about U.S.-Soviet nuclear relations, then I have a real hard time coming up with specific scenarios where one could make the case that, yes, this would make a substantial difference in how Iran or its clients would behave. Because what you hear instead are the vague kind of formulations about, well, a nuclear weapon would shield various forms of Iranian behavior. Or Iran could extend a nuclear umbrella to the likes of Lebanese Hezbollah. Those are scary-sounding words, but if you translate them into what that means specifically, what it means is that Iran would have to threaten credibly to escalate to the level of nuclear war, whatever is the thing in dispute. You know, the latest dust-up between Hezbollah and Israel, or whatever it is. And I have a hard time coming up with plausible scenarios along that line. We hear again and again, you know, the forms of Iranian behavior that we don't like, and they are indeed objectionable forms of behavior with regard to involvement with terrorist groups and the like. But what doesn't get asked is exactly what the difference would be between the Iranian Islamic Republic as we know it today and the Islamic Republic of Iran if they had a nuclear weapon. I'd be happy to go into this more in discussion. I think there is a basis for agreement. There is negotiating space yet to be explored between the P5+1 and Iran. And I would note how little effort and time has so far been spent on exploring that space. Before the Istanbul meeting last month, it was, as far as U.S.-Iranian diplomacy was concerned, as my friend Trita Parsi puts it, a single roll of the dice. He used that as the title of his book, to explain what the Obama administration had done during its first year, which was basically take one crack at a form of engagement, and when that didn't yield an agreement, well, we're just going to fall back on pressure and sanctions. And that's been the basic story for the last couple of years. It's going to take a lot of time and detailed negotiations, not just by the principals who met at Istanbul and will meet again in Baghdad, but at the next couple of levels down, about the details of inspection arrangements and access arrangements and the details of what sort of enrichment program would be permitted and so on. We have barely begun to see the exploration of that negotiating space. Istanbul was basically a get-acquainted meeting. And I would not place a lot of hope on material agreements coming out of Baghdad. In fact, the statement I heard the other day from Lady Ashton, I was kind of taken aback. She seemed to be getting in front of things a little bit and sounding rather optimistic. There are numerous challenges to success in these negotiations, even though, as I say, I think there is negotiating space to be explored. The history of distrust between us and the Iranians, which is well known to everyone in this room, I don't have to replay. Impatience and a failure to recognize what I just said about what an early stage we're at in these negotiations is going to be a problem. You are going to hear many, many voices right here in the United States, not to mention Israel and elsewhere, after Baghdad saying, well, we don't have an agreement, so diplomacy has failed once again. That kind of tone doesn't help, but we're going to hear lots of that. Some people are itching to declare negotiations a failure. There certainly are those people here in the United States. Goodness knows they're in Israel as well, including the government. And I dare say in Iran, among elements perhaps in the Revolutionary Guard, we have similar incentives. And some of these people are in a position to do things to make the prospects of negotiating success less than they otherwise would be. things like assassinations and sabotage in the other country, things like something that a hot-headed Rev Guard naval commander might do in the Persian Gulf to create an incident that, despite the wishes of the higher-ups in both Tehran and Washington, might spin out of control. And basically a lot that you're already hearing here in the United States in spinning up for Baghdad that we really can't trust the Iranians even if we did reach an agreement with them. And this is related to the whole question of inflexibility on both sides. On the Iranian side, I think there are, as I say, interests that would not welcome an agreement, interests that are served by having a continued hostile relationship, hostility seen from the United States and Israel and others. I agree with Jim Dobbins that sanctions have had an effect, and a salubrious effect, in trying to or to promote some of that more moderate rhetoric that he referred to. I think there is an interest in most of the top leadership in improving a relationship with the West. And some of the statements that the Supreme Leader made that got some notice, what he said about nuclear weapons supposedly being immoral under Islam. We should not take that as a literal guide to Iranian operational policy. However, the significance of a statement like that is it leaves him and the regime an out to sign on to understandings and agreements with the P5+1 and still be able to hold their head high and say, we didn't lose, we didn't cave, we never had any interest in having nuclear weapons in the first place, which of course is what the regime has been claiming all along. But you add this, this moral proclamation from the man at the top, and that will add weight to the face-saving tactic as well. The bigger problem, I think, as far as incentives on the Iranian side are concerned, is believing that the West, and the United States in particular, really wants a deal and intends to do business with the current regime rather than simply waiting until another regime materializes in Tehran. Think of all the talk that you hear week in and week out about regime change here in this country. Some of the spinning up for Baghdad, I've read some things that basically say that. And look at what we also left with what we did in Libya as, in my judgment, a very unhelpful lesson to regimes in Tehran and Pyongyang, too, by the way. They've drawn some of the lessons very explicitly. We did make a deal with Gaddafi for him to give up his unconventional weapons programs, including nuclear, as well as get out of the terrorism business. And of course, what he hoped to get out of it, what he thought he was getting out of it, was acceptance as a bona fide member of the international community in normal relations with the United States, which he got for a few years, but then the first chance we got to accomplish regime change, we took it and we helped overthrow it. That is not a very helpful message to try to send to the leaders in Tehran. And now most recently I see there was a report in the Wall Street Journal just in the last day or so about the Secretary of State possibly being on the verge of removing the Mujahideen cult from the foreign terrorist organization list. If that happens, it would be a big mistake in its own right and would be a very unhelpful move with regard to these negotiations with Iran. We've had the emphasis on sanctions here in the United States and all the debates in Congress, and one of the things that bothers me about the discourse on that is sanctions have come to be treated almost as if they were an end in itself. We've forgotten what we're trying to achieve here. Or if we haven't forgotten, different people are trying to achieve different things. What I would hope we're trying to achieve is influencing the incentives of the decision makers in Tehran with regard to reaching the kind of agreement we hope to reach through this negotiation process. But we've got the problem, as I mentioned, of persuading the other side that we really are serious about this and we're not just trying to tighten the screws more and more and more in the hope of actually undermining the regime and instead achieving the goal of regime change. Probably the biggest problem that we may face in closing a deal, or even if we close a tentative deal, making it stick, is walking back from sanctions on our side. This is going to be hard. It's hard partly because if you look at the U.S. sanctions, some of them aren't specifically geared to the nuclear question. They're geared to human rights and involvement in terrorism and other stuff. And as far as the politics of it are concerned, especially in a presidential election year, but even looking beyond November, it's going to be very difficult for any administration and any members of Congress to be in favor of a move that looks like being nice to Iran when we're still dealing with the Islamic Republic, we're still dealing with something short of what Jim Dobbins was describing as the long-term goals of getting them totally out of the nuclear business. We won't be achieving that anytime in the foreseeable future. So it's going to be politically very, very difficult for us to deliver in a way that will create the kinds of incentives that will enable the Islamic Republic leaders to sell a deal internally. One last point. Over the longer term, I think we really need to broaden the negotiating agenda. We've been so seized in such an incredibly narrow way on this one nuclear fixation, even though there are plenty of other issues we have to raise with the Iranians and grievances we have with the Islamic Republic, and they certainly have issues and grievances they want to raise with us. And that's in addition to the other respects, like Afghanistan, that Jim Dobbins worked on, where our interests still, to some extent, parallel. And I would add that we even have parallel interest in Iraq as well. If we did have a broader agenda, and I don't predict this is going to happen anytime soon, there is going to continue to be this narrow focus for the time being on the nuclear matter, it would not only enable us to exploit the areas in which our interests may overlap or parallel, it would enable us to chip away at the other grievances and problems we have. And it would make it easier because you've opened the opportunities for trade-offs and everything that results from a bigger negotiating space on even the issue that concerns us most, the nuclear weapons one. So before we get too far into the future, I think we're going to have to talk about a lot of other things. But thank you very much, Shireen, for the invitation.
Thank you.